Welcome to Marx 513. My name is Bernard Harcourt, and this is the full-length introduction to the seminar Marx 513 on Marx's German ideology, read in conversation with Monique Wittig's essay, The Category of Sex, with the critical theorist Jules Joanne Gleeson. A few months after completing the Paris manuscripts of 1844, which we just discussed with Renata Selekel at Marx 413, in February 1845, Marx is expelled from France by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, François Guizot, and moves his family to Brussels. There, Marx connects with Friedrich Engels, whom he had just met in Paris in August 1844. Together, they write and publish a polemical book against Bruno Bauer and the left Hegelians, which they title The Holy Family, a critique of critical criticism, published in 1845. Marx and Engels then begin to draft a manuscript in 2 volumes to which Marx gives the name The German Ideology. It's in preparation for that work that Marx jots down his theses on Feuerbach, which we discussed at the inaugural seminar with Etienne Balibar at Marx 113. The German Ideology, written in 1845 and 1846 and only published in full in 1932, has been the source of myriad interpretations and controversies over the materialist conception of history, over the dawn of revolution and communism, and over divergent theories of ideology. The work famously represented the point of rupture, according to Louis Althusser, between the early philosophical Marx and the mature scientific works. For that reason, paradoxically, Althusser accused the German ideology of itself being ideological. The work has also been critiqued for not articulating a Marxist theory of ideology that would apply to the belief systems of both those who dominate and those who resist, thus calling for further theoretical developments on ideology that would ultimately be supplied by Lenin, George Lukács, Antonio Gramsci, and the Frankfurt School, and possibly Michel Foucault in his work on regimes of truth. On the question of ideology, there are several ways to read the German ideology. I personally favor a heterodox reading, which I'll discuss, according to which the manuscript is a narrow critique of the Hegelian left Hegelians, Bruno Bauer, Max Stirner, but also Ludwig Feuerbach, a narrow critique that essentially treats them as ideologues in the sense in which Antoine Destutt de Tracy coined the term in the late 18th century, and that Napoleon turned it on them. On another reading, the German ideology is the main location where Marx develops his materialist conception of history from ancient times through feudalism to capitalism. And on this reading, the discussion of ideology is somewhat ancillary or superstructural. On a more expansive reading, the German ideology proposes a one-sided theory of ideology that applies exclusively to the ruling class. And on the most ambitious reading, the manuscript sets forth a general theory of ideology that is at the root of the entire tradition, from Antonio Gramsci's work on hegemony through the Frankfurt School's work to current idéologie critique. Now, despite my preference for the heterodox reading of the German ideology, which I'll explain, it is mainly the one-sided theory of ideology, limited to the dominant class, that has gained the most traction, and that can be identified, for instance, in the work of Monique Wittig, through which we will be interpreting the text, The German Ideology, at Marx 513, at the suggestion of Guillaume Rouleau. Guillaume Rouleau, a doctoral student at the EHESS, is completing a brilliant dissertation on the notion of ideology in French political philosophy since 1945. And in the dissertation, Rouleau traces the notion of ideology back to the German ideology and forward through several key stages in French philosophical discourse, beginning with Raymond Aron, continuing through Louis Althusser, and leading to materialist feminists of the 1970s and 80s, highlighting the work of Monique Wittig. Rouleau proposed that we pair Marx's Engels' The German Ideology with Wittig's article, The Category of Sex, published in 1982, for this session of Marx 513. Rouleau, incidentally, will be lecturing in March about Wittig's use of the concept of ideology in a keynote lecture for Marx 1313, a lecture that will form the basis of a forthcoming article. Now, most recently, Marx's manuscripts and Monique Wittig's writings have been key reference points for new writings in the field of transgender Marxism. This is evident in a new collection of writings titled Transgender Marxism and edited by Jules Joanne Gleeson and Elle O'Rourke, recently published by Pluto Press in 2021. Several contributors in the collected volume draw on the work of Wittig, including Jules Joanne Gleeson and Anja Heisler-Wieser-Flower. And so, to help us read and discuss and actualize the German ideology and Wittig, we're privileged to welcome to Marx 513 a brilliant critical theorist and the co-editor of Transgender Marxism, Jules Joanne Gleeson. Jules Gleeson is an author, historian, and comedian who has published essays in journals including Viewpoint Magazine, Invert Journal, the Boston Review, and Vice, and has performed internationally at a wide range of communist and queer cultural events. Jules Joanne Gleeson will present on Marx, Wittig, and transgender Marxism at the seminar. In this full introduction, I will provide some background on the three texts. I'll also argue strongly for the importance of reading Marx through the lens of Gleeson, O'Rourke, and other contributors to transgender Marxism. My encounter with the writings on transgender Marxism has been formative for my understanding of a full Marxian vision. Let me say a few words to summarize what I will argue later in this introduction before turning to the three texts. There is, on my reading, an abolitionist line that runs through Marx, Wittig, and a certain strand of transgender Marxism. Regarding the latter, an abolitionist strand that Jules Gleeson discusses and develops in her essays in Blind Field, titled The Call for Gender Abolition and Abolitionism in the 21st Century. So there's a line, really, an abolitionist line that runs through these three works, Marx, Wittig, and certain contributions to transgender Marxism. Now, as Gleeson underscores, not all transgender, trans theories and not all strands of transgender Marxism advocate for the abolition of gender. Some remain attached to a notion of gender that grounds the unique standpoint and necessity of gender transition, and as a result, some come into conflict with queer theories that envisage the radical abolition of gender. Not all Marxist or Marxian theories are alike either. Some Marxist theories remain focused on the category of class only or predominantly, and dismiss claims to racial or gender identity or gender recognition as counterproductive and undermining class struggle. Others are more inclusive along some dimensions, but not always all, and some Marxist theories are all-inclusive. I don't want to impose one reading of transgender Marxism on the many different contributions in the collection, Transgender Marxism, but I do discern in certain chapters an argument for a form of Marxism that includes not only the abolition of class, but the abolition as well of gender. I hear that, for instance, in Rosalie's contribution and suggestion regarding what they write, quote, the possibility of collective transition to communism as a process of undoing, remaking, and even substantively abolishing gender. I read this as well in Jules Gleeson's articles in Blind Field, calling, cautiously, for gender abolition. I also hear that distinctly in Monique Wittig's work, as I will discuss. In fact, I view that as Wittig's central demand and central ambition, to destroy the totalitarian category of sex. In Wittig's words, to, quote, destroy the sexes as a sociological reality. Now, as we all know, Marx's writings are explicitly abolitionist when it comes to private property and to capital. We actually covered those topics in Abolition Democracy 1313, discussing with Etienne Balibar and others the abolition of private property at Abolition Democracy 513, and discussing the abolition of capital with Martin Czar at Abolition Democracy 613. But the abolition of gender is not something that one finds in Marx's writings, certainly not explicitly. And on some readings, of course, Marx was somewhat inattentive, to say the least, on issues of sex and gender. So it really requires reading Marx through Wittig and a certain strand of transgender Marxism to develop a more thoroughgoing abolitionist framework for Marx. I believe that is crucial and necessary, and after giving some background on the materials we'll be reading from Marx 513, I'll explain why. Okay, so let me start then with Marx and Engels' manuscript, The German Ideology. Marx and Engels write the manuscript over the period from about November 1845 to June 1846. They never publish it, although they tried hard. This should be somewhat heartwarming to the many of us who've had manuscripts rejected by publishers. In their case, they were forced to abandon publication because of censorship. Now, Marx famously explained the history of the writing of the German ideology in the preface to a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which was published in 1859. And this is what Marx said. When in the spring of 1845, he too, and he's referring to Friedrich Engels, when he too came to live in Brussels, we decided to set forth together our conception as opposed to the ideological one of German philosophy. In fact, to settle accounts with our former philosophical conscience. The intention was carried out in the form of a critique of post-Hegelian philosophy. The manuscript, and he's referring to the German ideology, 2 large octavo volumes, had long ago reached the publishers in Westphalia, when we were informed that owing to changed circumstances, it could not be printed. We abandoned the manuscript to the gnawing criticism of the mice, all the more willingly since we had achieved our main purpose, self-clarification. Of the scattered works in which, at the time, we presented one or another aspects of our views to the public, I shall mention only the Manifesto of the Communist Party, jointly written by Engels and myself, and a Discours sur le libre-échange, which I myself published. The salient points of our conception were first outlined in an academic, although polemic, form in my Misère de la Philosophie, this book which was aimed at Proudhon and appeared in 1847. The publication of an essay on wage labor, he's referring to the text Wage, Labor, and Capital, written in German, in which I combined the lectures I had held on this subject at the German Workers' Association in Brussels, was interrupted by the February Revolution and my forcible removal from Belgium in consequence. So that gives us a good idea of the timing, the framing, and how ultimately the ideas of the German ideology were published. Engels returned to after the death of Marx, but did not publish the German ideology, although he did publish the preparatory theses on Feuerbach in 1888 as an appendix to his book on Feuerbach, as I discussed in my introduction to Marx 113. Portions of the German ideology, less than half, were published by the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, including Eduard Bernstein, in the first decades of the 20th century. The first part of the German ideology on Feuerbach was published in 1924 in Russian and 1926 in German. And then the entire manuscript, all of it with the parts on Stirner and Bauer, was published for the first time in full in 1932 in German by the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow, the same year as the first publication of the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. So how do we go about interpreting the text? Let me start with my heterodox reading, which I call a critique of ideologues. Today, in the more conventional presentation of the German ideology, we only read the first part of the work, which is dedicated to the old materialism of Ludwig Feuerbach and contains the historical account of the emergence of capitalism, the discussion of communism and revolution, and the passages on the theory of ideology. Much of this material was originally written in later chapters on Bauer and Stirner, but then moved forward into the section on Feuerbach, the first section. Now, it's important to emphasize that that first section only represents about 13% of the full manuscript, which for the vast majority of the rest of it is dedicated to a biting and polemical criticism of the young Hegelians, with the two main parts being called, quote, Saint Bruno and Saint Max, referring, of course, to Bruno Bauer and Max Stirner. Those critiques of Bauer and Stirner, with detailed annotated passages from their books, represents the bulk of the first volume, which is the only volume that was completed. It was a volume that was titled Critique of Modern German Philosophy according to its representatives Feuerbach, Bauer, and Stirner. A second volume was intended to address and was titled Critique of German Socialism according to its various prophets. It included a critique of Karl Grün, George Kuhlmann, and French socialists, but only extended for about 80 pages. Engels would continue that work with his manuscript on the True Socialists, which he wrote between January and April 1847. The bulk of the manuscript of the German ideology is, then, a critique of the idealism of the young Hegelians. On my heterodox reading, it represents a critique of ideologues. Ideologues in the sense in which Destutt de Tracy defined and embraced the term ideology, which he coined in 1796, as the science of ideas, and ideologues as those who engage in the science of ideas. On this reading, the manuscript as a whole is less about the development of a theory of ideology and represents instead a targeted critique of certain ideologues, much like Napoleon would later turn against the French ideologues and accuse them of undermining the revolutionary spirit with their false ideas and their idealism. It's notable, for example, that Marx and Engels use the term Ideologen, which is the German equivalent of the French term idéologue, or in English, ideologues. In the opening clause of the very first chapter on Feuerbach, they write about how, wie deutsche Ideologen melden, in other words, as the German ideologues report, as the German ideologues signal. They refer to the young Hegelian Ideologen later on. And this This is translated in English as ideologists, although I would argue that the term in English should be ideologues, referring back to the earlier intellectual movement in France that Destutt de Tracy began. Choosing instead to translate as ideologist is a crucial interpretive choice because it changes the meaning and texture of the text. On the unorthodox reading I'm suggesting here, associated with the term ideologues, the text becomes a one-sided critique of the young Hegelians as false scientists of ideas, as those who believe that everything takes, quote, in Marx and Engels' words, takes place in the realm of pure thought. This entails a very different understanding of the concept of ideology than the multivalent notion of ideologies that develops later and is privileged by readers such as Antonio Gramsci and the Frankfurt School. Marx and Engels oppose their materialism to these ideologues, these false scientists of ideas. One gets a good sense of this from the preface to Volume 1 on modern German philosophy, which is usually not included in our renditions of the German ideology, but where Marx and Engels write, and I quote, "Hitherto men have constantly made up for themselves false conceptions about themselves. Let us teach men, says one, to exchange these imaginations for thoughts which correspond to the essence of man, says the second, to take up a critical attitude to them, says the third, to knock them out of their heads. And existing reality will collapse." And here's the critique. These innocent and childlike fancies are the kernel of the modern young Hegelian philosophy. The first volume of the present publication has the aim of uncloaking these sheep, who take themselves and are taken for wolves, of showing how their bleating merely imitates in a philosophic form the conceptions of the German middle class. It is, they say, the aim to debunk and discredit the philosophical struggle with the shadows of reality, which appeals to the dreamy and muddled German nation. And so on my reading of the preface, the ambition is not to develop a theory of history, actually, nor a general theory of ideology, but to debunk a set of ideologues who believed, so Marx and Engels argued, that they could transform the world by playing with ideas, who operated at the level of ideas only, who were engaged in a science of ideas, like les idéologues français. But of course, while drafting the critiques of Bauer and Stirner, Marx and Engels begin to lay down their own theories of history and ideology, which they would collect and introduce into the first part on Feuerbach, and which soon took on a life of their own within Marx circles. So this leads to the more conventional readings and the sole focus on Feuerbach and beyond. In presenting their version of materialism, as against the old materialism of Feuerbach, Marx and Engels set down their own new materialist method, a materialist method that begins from real living individuals in their physical material conditions based on purely empirical facts. They declare, the first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. This then leads Marx and Engels to develop a series of material histories, of forms of ownership, of modes of production, of the state of society, of the development of consciousness, and, most importantly, of the relations and contradictions between these, between these forces that drive history. So they They put together a series of interconnected histories that is well known, and it traverses a number of stages. People are familiar with this. First, tribal ownership in patriarchal family structures. Second, ancient, communal, city and state ownership forms. Third, feudal or estate property relations of the Middle Ages in towns and the country, leading to feudal kingdoms. All of this is followed by the rise of manufacturing and capital in Italy, Flanders, England, and France in the 15th and 16th centuries, accompanied by vagabondage and the disintegration of the feudal system. Then there's commerce, navigation, colonial monopolies, and the maritime wars of the 1650s to the 1790s, and then, of course, to contemporary times for Marx and Engels. They also pose a history of law as it relates to the division of labor and to property, which are essentially the same. This history culminates in proletariat revolution leading to communism, the necessary outcome of the conflict between productive forces and social relations. These passages are legion and legend, to recall but one, wrapping up the conclusions from the materialist conception of history. Marx and Engels write, "In the development of productive forces, there comes a stage when productive forces and means of intercourse are brought into being, which, under the existing relationships, only cause mischief and are no longer productive but destructive forces." And connected with this, a class is called forth, which has to bear all the burdens of society without enjoying its advantages, which, ousted from society, is forced into the most decided antagonism to all other classes. Both for the production on a mass scale of this communist consciousness and for the success of the cause itself, the alteration of men on a mass scale is necessary, an alteration which can only take place in a practical movement, a revolution. This revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. There are many passages like this that are legendary and that show the evolution and the necessity of revolution and communism. Now, these histories amount to a materialist conception of history, which is a term that Marx and Engels use, by contrast to historical materialism, which is a later superposition. A materialist conception of history that they use in order to emphasize that history happens through the confrontation of material elements, forces of production and social relations, and not through the development of self-consciousness or ideas. As they emphasize in the section titled Conclusions from the Materialist Conception of History, they write, "The transformation of history into world history is not indeed a mere abstract act on the part of the self-consciousness, the world spirit, or any other metaphysical specter, but a quite material, empirically verifiable act, an act the proof of which every individual furnishes as he comes and goes, eats, drinks, and clothes himself." More modestly, again, this can be understood as the rejection of young Hegelians as ideologues, false scientists of ideas who, like Hegel, mistook a story about the development of self-consciousness for the real history of the world. More boldly, a reader like Althusser, in line with the later Engels, would see in this work the foundation of both a new historical materialist theory of history, in his words, and a dialectical materialist theory of philosophy, perhaps in Stalin's. As Althusser writes succinctly, the epistemological break represented by the German ideology, quote, concerns conjointly two distinct theoretical disciplines. By founding the theory of historical materialism, Marx simultaneously broke with his erstwhile ideological philosophy and established a new philosophy, dialectical materialism. Now, as noted earlier, this is the German ideology is exact location where Althusser identifies what he calls epistemological break in Marx's intellectual development, a break from an earlier philosophical, ideological period to a mature, scientific, economic period, which itself begins first with a transition period from 1845 to 1857, followed by the full-blown scientific economic works of 1857. Althusser locates the epistemological break in the German ideology because, according to Althusser, it is there that Marx self-consciously sheds his philosophical skin, but still in a philosophical way. Althusser is referring specifically to the passage where Marx and Engels write, quote, "We resolve to settle accounts with our erstwhile philosophical conscience." On Althusser's reading, then, Marx's immediately preceding work, his notes ad Feuerbach, published by Engels under the title The Theses on Feuerbach, contain still the ambiguities and confusions that, in his words, mark out the earlier limit of this break. Now, insofar as they oppose themselves as materialists to idealists and to older materialists like Feuerbach, Marx and Engels emphasize the primacy of material forces of production and social, economic, political relations over ideas, concepts, and consciousness, what they refer to as mental production, as expressed in the language of politics, law, morality, religion, metaphysics, etc. of a people. There's this important key distinction between material forces of production and social relations on the one hand, and these mental productions. They invert Hegel's phenomenology of spirit to emphasize how it is not ideas or consciousness that develops independently, but material conditions and real existence. On my reading, the reference to Hegelian philosophy is direct, even when it is not explicit, as when they write, "Morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness thus no longer retain the semblance of independence. They have no history, no development. But men, developing their material production and their material intercourse, alter, along with this, their real existence, their thinking, and the products of their thinking. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. In the first method of approach, the starting point is consciousness taken as the living individual. In the second method, which conforms to real life, it is the real living individuals themselves, and consciousness is considered solely as their consciousness." And the main idea here, of course, is that it's not ideas but material shifts in forces of production that drive history, right? And at the same time, that it is not criticism, they say, but revolution that is the driving force of history. And so what they emphasize, of course, is that it's only possible to achieve real liberation in the real world, they say, by employing real means. Okay, slavery cannot be abolished without the steam engine and the mule and the spinning jenny, they say, they write. Serfdom cannot be abolished without improved agriculture. And in general, they say, people cannot be liberated as long as they are unable to obtain food and drink, housing and clothing in adequate quality and quantity. And this is the idea that, in their words, liberation is a historical, not a mental act, and it's brought about by material conditions. Now, I should add that cooperation plays a large role in this history. We discussed cooperation with Etienne Balibar, Marx and cooperation, at Cooperism 513 last year. Marx and Engels refer to cooperation as an essential social relation among individuals. They refer to it as a social stage, itself a productive force. And they suggest that it's the force that is transformed by the communist revolution into the ultimate mastery of all these powers. The German ideology leaves the reader with a vision of communist society, which Marx and Engels describe in a famous passage. In communist society, they write, where nobody has an exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. To criticize after dinner. What a beautiful and somewhat utopian, in the best sense of the word, vision of a future society of critique and praxis. I believe that Jules Gleeson will have something to say about this at the seminar and how it relates to transgender Marxism. Now, let me turn to the second text, Monique Wittig's essay, The Category of Sex. As I indicated earlier, a more common reading of the German ideology focuses on the passages on ideology that develop a general theory regarding the ways in which the languages of politics, law, morality, religion, metaphysics are in fact the dominant ideas of the ruling class and serve as an illusion that maintains their dominance and oppression. It's within this current of interpretation that Guillaume Rouleau places Monique Wittig's work, both as a return to combined with a sharp critique of Marx. Wittig draws on Marx's writings on ideology to formulate her critique while simultaneously critiquing aspects of a Marxist approach. By way of background, Monique Wittig, born in 1935 and deceased in 2003, was a brilliant philosopher, novelist, and I would say a queer theorist avant la lettre. Monique Wittig wrote foundational work, engaged in foundational praxis in lesbian feminism. I actually had the great privilege of being a colleague of Monique Wittig's when I entered the academy at the University of Arizona in Tucson in the late 90s, where Wittig taught and lived, and recall inspiring conversations with Wittig and also about her work with other colleagues and friends in Tucson, such as the artist Olivier Mosset, who shared with me the collection of Wittig's writings, Paris la politique et autre histoire, when it first appeared in 1999. Wittig gave the essay, The Category of Sex, as a talk in New York in 1979 and then published it in Feminist Issues in 1982. When she published it there, she date-stamped it Berkeley, 1976. And Wittig then included it with other essays in The Straight Mind in 1992. As Rouleau points out, Wittig was drawing on, but simultaneously criticizing, the German ideology in the essay. Wittig argues that the dominant way of thinking about sex and gender is through the lens of difference, of sexual difference, but that this way of understanding the world is an ideological product of the social, economic, and political domination of men over women. Instead of using a framework of difference, Wittig argues for a standpoint of conflict and struggle, similar to class struggle, or to the struggle of enslaved persons against their enslavers. By replacing the discourse of difference with sex struggle, Wittig aspires to overcome and abolish the very category of sex. Wittig's argument is brilliant and right, I would argue. What I'd like to do is rehearse it step by step with Wittig in the way, say, that analytic Marxists would do with Marx. One caveat first. Some of the concepts and language are dated. The binarity of men versus women does not account for the possibility of non-binary or queer persons, and I believe does not anticipate transgender issues. The language of master and slave that Wittig uses does not use person-first language. There's a lot in the writing that feels out of step with contemporary discourse, just as I'm sure what I'm saying right now will appear dated pretty quickly. For purposes of reconstructing the argument, though, there are certain features of the text, such as the binarity of sex, that I will need to maintain without necessarily endorsing. All right, so let's go step by step with Monique Wittig. The first point, step 1. The starting point is the dominant hegemonic viewpoint that sex is a matter of difference, what is usually called sexual difference. Now, Wittig uses the single term sex, as was common in the late 1970s and early 1980s, to signify both what people refer to as biological sex today, as well as what we now recognize are socially constructed conceptions of gender. So the term sex, as Wittig uses it, should be understood today as comprising both sex and gender, both the distinctions of male-female and of masculine-feminine. The term category of sex that Wittig uses is to be understood in contrast to the other socioeconomic and political categories such as class, race, or religion. It's important to emphasize that Wittig is describing her present, the late 1970s, early 1980s. But what she says remains true for the most part still today, I would argue. The starting point is then, with these definitions in place, the starting point is the hegemonic idea that sex and gender are best understood through the lens today and are portrayed through the lens of sexual difference. Step 2. The viewpoint of sexual difference dominates the various approaches to social inquiry, including philosophical, biological, and social scientific. Now, Wittig emphasizes that the viewpoint of sexual difference is pervasive across the disciplines and the various ways of analyzing and thinking about the world. These include ontological approaches that focus on constitutive being, natural science approaches like biology or genetics, and social scientific approaches such as sociology or anthropology, all of which rest on these, and all of these rest on the idea of difference, as do other scientific approaches. It's pervasive, it's hegemonic in the natural and human sciences, and also in ordinary discourse. Step 3. The viewpoint of sexual difference even dominates Marxist approaches to reality. So Monique Wittig emphasizes that certain Marxist approaches, and Wittig actually writes the Marxist approach, not just certain Marxist approaches, but the Marxist approach. She emphasizes that they also rest on the idea of sexual difference. And this refers to the idea in Marx of, quote, a natural division of labor in the family, or a, quote, division of labor that was originally nothing but the division of labor in the sexual act. Wittig does not provide a citation for these quotations, but the first comes from the discussion of the first tribal form of ownership in the German ideology, where Marx and Engels write that at this underdeveloped stage of production, they write, the division of labor is at this stage still very elementary and is confined to a further extension of the natural division of labor existing in the family. The second quotation Wittig uses also comes from the German ideology and is found in the discussion of the tribal consciousness a few paragraphs later, where Marx and Engels write, quote, with these there develops the division of labor, which was originally nothing but the division of labor in the sexual act, then that division of labor which develops spontaneously or naturally by virtue of natural predisposition, i.e. physical strength, needs, accidents, etc., etc. Now, there's been controversy over these statements, and some Marxists have argued that they should not be taken out of their context, which is an elaboration of sheep-like or herd-like consciousness. Those are Marx and Engels' words, in which man is still at a stage that resembles animal life. Regardless, though, Marx and Engels reify in these passages an essentialized view of the physical and sexual relationship between men and women. There's no question they naturalize male domination in sex and physical strength through a state of nature mode of reasoning. And this, despite Marx's searing critique of state of nature theories in the Paris manuscripts of 1844. As you'll recall from last seminar, Marx wrote in the Paris manuscripts, quote, do not let us go back to a fictitious primordial condition as the political economist does when he tries to explain. Such a primordial condition explains nothing. He merely pushes the equation away into a gray nebulous distance. So these are debates and controversies that are often associated with the remarkable work of Silvia Federici and her critique of primitive accumulation in Marx, with feminist Marxism and Federici's work on reproductive labor and the wages for housework movement. They've also been developed most in relation to Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. We'll return to some of those debates in our next seminar, Marx 613, with the authors of Feminism for the 99%, a Manifesto, Cinzia Arruzza, Tithi Bhattacharya, and Nancy Fraser. For purposes here, though, this third step, the point represents a sharp critique of not all, but certain Marx's approaches to the role of the family and sexual difference. Okay, step 4. Step 4 is that the dominant viewpoint of sexual difference serves to mask the reality of the conflict between the sexes and the domination of men over women. Wittig argues that the sexes are not in a relationship of difference, but instead a relationship of conflict, a state of opposition, a contradiction, and that men dominate women in society on the mode of the master-slave relationship. Wittig calls this the dominant thought. It is the thought of the dominant class, namely men. It is at the same time the thought of domination. As such, it is known and recognized by the dominant class, even though it is ignored by the dominated class or disbelieved. Wittig emphasizes that men, quote, know perfectly well that they are dominating women. By contrast, she writes, quote, women do not know that they are totally dominated by men, and when they acknowledge the fact, they can hardly believe it. So it functions through this knowledge and ignorance. It functions through knowledge. In this sense, it's a form of knowledge power. It's important that this form of dominance is not natural, but socially produced. In a Rousseauian way, Wittig insists that there are no natural forms of dominance. Dominance is a product of society. As a category of dominance, Wittig writes, It cannot be a product of natural dominance, but of the social dominance of women by men, for there is but social dominance. Okay, this takes us then to step 5. There is but social dominance. In this sense, the viewpoint of sexual difference functions as an ideology, as Marx and Engels understood the term in the German ideology. And I thank Guillaume Rouleau for drawing my attention to this point, which he will develop further in March in his keynote and article. So Wittig proposes that the mindset of sexual difference is an ideological product of the state of domination of men over women. The dominant viewpoint functions to mask the conflict between the sexes behind the idea of difference. The result is that many women do not even realize that their relationship to men is one of domination. As ideology, it naturalizes the idea of sexual difference and renders difference the main way that we all understand sex and gender. Wittig expresses this in the following formulation. Quote, "The ideology of sexual difference functions as a censorship in our culture by masking, on the ground of nature, the social opposition between men and women." Notice the terms she's using, right? To mask, to conceal. It is here, in this specific context, that Wittig then draws mostly on Marx and Engels. It's here that she quotes the famous passage from the German ideology, which notably is her only reference in this essay. It's the famous passage about ideology, which is the basis of the general theory of ideology that people extract from the German ideology, where they write that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e. the class, which is the ruling material force of society, is the same at the same time its ruling intellectual force. You are familiar with the passage, I'm sure. But what's clear is that throughout the essay, Wittig is referring back to this theory of ideology. At various points, she covers each element. It's almost possible to map Wittig's argument onto each clause of Marx and Engels. So, for instance, that first clause, the idea of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, etc. Well, Wittig actually opens up the essay by saying, "The perenniality of the sexes and the perenniality of slaves and masters proceed from the same belief. And as there are no slaves without masters, there are no women without men," right? So this idea that in every epoch, right, the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas. In every epoch, it's the perenniality of the sexes, the perenniality of slave and master. Or the next clause, where Marx and Engels write, "The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it." Well, here, too, Wittig writes, "The divisions are abstracted and turned into concepts by the masters." Right? That is pretty much the same idea. Or the third clause in that famous trilogy, "The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships." And Wittig writes, "It is oppression that creates sex and not the contrary." So Wittig deploys the framework of ideology in this text, mapping on to the German ideology the ideas of the ideological dominance of men over women. And Wittig does so as well in other essays, including One Is Not Born a Woman in 1981 and Homo Sum in 1990, most often referencing specifically the German ideology. Once again, this is something that Guillaume Rouleau will develop later. Step 6. This understanding of reality is dialectical materialist insofar as it recognizes a contradiction, the opposition between the sexes, because of a materialist analysis focused on material rather than ideal conditions, and leads to an overcoming of the opposition in a dialectical movement. So in several instances throughout the essay, Wittig insists that the analysis is both materialist and dialectical. By materialist, Wittig means that the opposition between sexes, in her words, always belong to a material order. That material order is the reality that, quote, women perform 3/4 of the work in society, in the public as well as the private domain, plus the bodily work of reproduction. So the materiality of opposition and domination is realized through the marriage contract, Wittig writes, that serves to bind women to the material conditions of reproduction. The materiality is physical. It involves the physical surrender of the woman's body, right? So those are all the elements of materiality. And by dialectical, what Wittig means is really a process of change and movement. For Wittig, dialectic is associated with change, with movement. And she specifically writes, as long as there is no conflict and no struggle, Wittig maintains, there is no dialectic, there is no change, no movement. Step 7. It is only when women begin to struggle against the domination of men that people begin to understand that the relationship between men and women is one of social opposition and not just difference. So the hold of the ideology of sexual difference begins to let go once women rebel and start to struggle. Wittig argues that this is similar to the way that the domination over an enslaved person becomes denaturalized when they begin to struggle. It is the moment of struggle that transforms difference into opposition. In other words, it's praxis, political action, that unveils and demystifies at the same time as it attacks domination. Wittig's theory is a theory of praxis and critique. The important idea for me, Wittig writes, is that before the conflict, rebellion, struggle, there are no categories of opposition, but only of difference. And it is not before the struggle breaks out that the violent reality of the oppositions and the political nature of the difference become manifest. So notice that it's really the moment of praxis as struggle that deconstructs the ideology. It's praxis that denaturalizes the sexual difference. And here too, the model is the relationship between the enslaver and the enslaved person. Because the same thing, Wittig says, happens in the context of slavery, right? It's only when there is struggle that enslaved persons begin to see the opposition rather than the differences. Step 8. The struggle simultaneously reveals the opposition between sexes and creates the condition of possibility of a resolution for overcoming the contradiction. So it's important for Wittig that the category of sex does not exist before social relations. It is created by society, or more exactly by men, as a device of dominance, as a form of dominance. As Wittig underscores, the category of sex does not exist a priori before all society. It arises in a dialectical movement that allows for its overcoming. It arises and simultaneously founds the kind of society that is heterosexual and patriarchal. As Wittig writes, the category of sex is the product of heterosexual society that turns half of the population into sexual beings. So it is the product of conflict and opposition. It arises and thus it can be overcome. It is part of a dialectical process. Step 9. Once revealed, it is clear that the category of sex applies only to women. As a form of domination, the category of sex attaches only to women and not to men. Men do not have a sex. They are the norm, Wittig argues. Only women are sexually identified. And so Wittig writes, the category of sex is the category that sticks to women, for only they cannot be conceived outside of it. Only they are sex, the sex, and sex they have been made in their minds, bodies, acts, gestures. Even their murders and beatings are sexual indeed. The category of sex tightly holds women. Step 10. Once exposed, the extent and totalitarian nature of the domination becomes clear. Wittig emphasizes the totalitarian nature of the domination. Wittig puts it at the level of the Inquisition, of Nazism, of terrorism, of sex trafficking. The category of sex, Wittig insists, is a totalitarian one, she writes, which to prove true has its inquisitions, its courts, its tribunals, its body of laws, its terrors, its tortures, its mutilations, its executions, its police. Women, she writes, must wear their yellow star, their constant smile, day and night. So the material condition is one of violence and forced sexuality, a period of forced sexual service like military service. And finally, step 11. The resolution happens by means of the abolition of the sexes. The concept of abolition is central to Monique Wittig's essay. Wittig uses the term abolition or abolishing frequently. It's 5 times in the essays. She closes the essay on that theme. It's really the demand of the essay in the clearest terms. It's what the essay calls for. With reference to the abolition of the declaration of sex, Wittig concludes the essay with these words, I say, it is about time to do so. Now, abolition is tied to the notion of destruction. Wittig argues for the destruction of the category of sex. We must destroy it, she exclaims. We must destroy the sexes as a sociological reality if we want to start to exist. In this regard, Wittig emphasizes that the moment of abolition in the context of sex should occur in a parallel fashion to both class conflict and race conflict, and that at least with regard to race, society is at an even more advanced stage. Regarding class struggle, Wittig writes that it is, quote, precisely that which resolves the contradictions between two opposed classes by abolishing them at the same time as it constitutes and reveals them as classes. With regard to race, Wittig notes that people are already aware that differentiation by race is discriminatory. Wittig emphasizes that that has not yet happened with regard to differentiation by sex. The essay is prescriptive insofar as Wittig expressly states that all women should, in her word, should undertake, quote, the class struggle between women and men, which, quote, resolves the contradictions between the sexes, abolishing them at the same time that it makes them understood. In the end, Wittig's is a radical argument with a radical ending, the abolition of sexes. These themes are continued in certain writings on transgender Marxism, writings collected by Jules Joanne Gleeson and Elle O'Rourke in their volume Transgender Marxism. It is that thread of abolitionism that runs through in different versions or in different colors Marx, Wittig, and transgender Marxism that I find most compelling. Let me first, though, say a few words to present generally the collection Transgender Marxism. So, from the collection Transgender Marxism, as I understand Gleeson and O'Rourke, the concept of transgender Marxism has both a negative and a positive dimension. First, the negative dimension. The negative dimension builds on Marx's concern with the physical and bodily element of exploitation. Marx was certainly attuned to the physicality of exploitation. As we saw in the Paris manuscripts, Marx elaborated on how workers were reduced to their basic animal needs like eating, sleeping, and procreating, how the proletariat became pure physical labor. Gleeson and O'Rourke suggest a parallel with transgender persons who tend to be hardest hit with regard to the physical forms of exploitation. Trans persons are, as Gleeson and O'Rourke write, quote, more likely to experience poverty, destitution, engage in sex work, experience abuse and mistreatment by wider society and the police and the criminal justice system. This, they suggest, translates into a more proletarianized condition. As they say, in short, quote, we serve the cause as exemplary proletarians. Gleeson and O'Rourke underscore the dark side of this proximity. Because they are at the margins, trans persons are assumed to be allies and comrades to Marxism, but are often treated as the exotic other or viewed as merely tag-alongs. Transgender persons are presumed to be radical and rebellious, but treated merely as a supplement to ongoing struggles. Quote, we are of note due to our suffering and by dint of our stigmatization. Little is left for the actual substance of trans life, the experiences of surviving in the context of separation that we already share among ourselves, and the resultant insights for a broader and refreshed view of capitalism's reproduction. So that's the negative side. Regarding the positive side, which one already gets a sense of in that last quote, right? Our insights for a broader and refreshed view of capitalism's reproduction. This already gestures to a positive dimension of transgender Marxism, which Gleeson and O'Rourke distinguish from other efforts at deriving a positive theory from the transgender experience, such as Paul Preciado's pharmacological approach in Testo Junkie, or Gail Salomon's phenomenological approach in Assuming a Body. For the positive element, there are certain formulations in transgender Marxism that I find most compelling and help me interpret best the argument. There are three in particular that help guide my reading. First formulation, and one of the most incisive to me, is actually the final sentence of Gleeson and O'Rourke's introduction, where they write, "What has been made can be unmade." Along these lines, another author in the collection, Rosa Lee, proposes in a chapter titled Judith Butler's Scientific Revolution that, quote, "the possibility of collective transition to communism as a process of undoing, remaking, or substantively abolishing gender." These ideas of what has been made can be unmade, of undoing, remaking. What these first formulations suggest, to me, is that the transgender experience is one of the closest experiences to the kind of radical transformation of naturalized existence that Marxism presupposes. The power and resilience of the natural, in scare quotes, of that which is considered to be natural, such as private property, is at the very core of Marxist thinking. The fact that value becomes naturalized and that all social relations are evacuated from value and the commodity, or the idea that capitalist relations of production are efficient and necessary. All of these fixed beliefs come to feel as if they are essential to human existence. They begin to feel overwhelming as well, as if there is no way that can be unmade. But it is here that the transgender proposition, that what has been made can be unmade, has so much force. It's important to emphasize that this transgender proposition does not essentialize a binary transformation. There is a more open concept of transformation at play. As Gleeson and O'Rourke write, not every trans life fits the teleological model of binary transition. In fact, very few ever do. Nor should our account of transition have to be straightforward in order to receive formal validation. So the idea here is not binarity, but transformation, the possibility of transforming nature. And that, I think, is very powerful, since it is both at the heart of transgender Marxism and at the heart of Marx's work of transforming what we consider to be natural. A second formulation that I find in transgender Marxism to be particularly compelling is the idea that transgender persons are often unwelcome in their family, and so choose and create their own chosen communities. The so frequent and hurtful rejection by the family propels the formation of new relations and new communities. Gleeson and O'Rourke write, quote, "To emancipate trans people requires, above all else, overturning class divisions, reversing our separation from the means of production, and developing new forms for nurture beyond the family." This resonates with the central theme, core to Marx's writings, that revolutionary peoples must rise up, unite, and deliberately shape a new society, new communities. They must create new communities of solidarity and commonality. Jules Joanne Gleeson discusses the need to build transgender communities in the chapter, How Do Gender Transitions Happen, in Transgender Marxism. Gleeson underscores the intentionality and the effort. Communities are never to be assumed as unified or taken for granted, Gleeson writes. Trans communities, like any other kind, always have to be actively cultivated and sustained across time. Then there's a third formulation that I find very compelling. A third formulation involves the demand for full participation of transgender persons and movements within Marxism, and not just merely inclusion. The demand of transgender Marxism, as I understand it, is a kind of full participation that goes beyond mere inclusion, or what is often referred to as tokenism. Too frequently, Gleeson and O'Rourke emphasize, quote, "Trans people and trans struggles are taken as being relevant only insofar as they boost struggles in which socialist groups are already participants or in which they wish to participate." The demand goes beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion. It aspires to a full-blown relation to Marxism. I was going to say a full-blown integration, but it is not just integrationist, I believe, because that again assumes the priority of Marxism. On the other hand, it does not subsume Marxism to transgender theory, so it aspires to a paradigm, a different paradigm, something of full mutual constitutiveness. And this relates to the imperative that contemporary Marxism get beyond an exclusive focus on class and class struggle, as well as beyond anything that might be considered mere inclusion, to a full-throttled embrace of what are typically marginalized theories, such as transgender theory. Now, there are other helpful formulations in the introduction. At times, Gleeson and O'Rourke refer to transgender communism rather than transgender Marxism. And that also captures something important. The ambition is communism. And I think sometimes that helps understand transgender Marxism as a movement, right, towards something like transgender communalism. As Gleeson and O'Rourke write, with stakes this high, a much more drastic intervention to world history is needed. Our circumstances demand more than one simple answer to a complex series of questions. Finally, there is also an important abolitionist formulation in Transgender Marxism regarding the abolition of gender, which is, to me, key for a couple of reasons. First, because it ties inextricably to the abolition of capital and to the abolition of the carceral sphere. Second, because it indexes as well Michel Foucault's abolitionist side. As Gleeson and O'Rourke write, our end is not just a more rigorous understanding of our social afflictions, but fuel for the abolition of what has long been intolerable. In that use of the word intolerable, I hear a reference to Foucault. The concept of the intolerable was central to Foucault, especially during the early 70s, with his participation in the abolitionist struggles against the prison. It's no accident that Kevin Thompson and Perry Zern gave to their book on Foucault and the writings of the Prisons Information Group the title Intolerable. All right, so rereading Marx through Wittig and Transgender Marxism. I think that rereading Monique Wittig and the Transgender Marxism collection really underscores for me that Marx's writings did not adequately address sex or gender. For this reason, I would argue it is essential that we read Marx through the lens of Wittig's version of feminist materialism and of an abolitionist version of transgender Marxism. Why? Well, I promised to answer that question at the beginning of the essay. The reason, very simply, is that there is no justification for a differential distribution of burdens based on sex or gender. Women and men, conventionally defined, are, along every conceivable dimension, equal. Equal in brilliance, resourcefulness, strength, ambition. It is only differential treatment, upbringing, and cultural training that produce category distinctions, such as more aggressive or violent, or more relational or more caring behaviors. These differences are chiefly the product of upbringing, as evidenced by the wide range of variations between and within different societies, at different times, in different cultural contexts. Sex and gender need to be abolished ultimately, so that all humans can thrive equally without domination, which is not to say that this can happen immediately. Instantaneous gender blindness would be cruelly counterproductive. Because of male domination and the reality of gender relations of power today, it will require work to create the space for the abolition of the sexes, just as cooperation democracy is necessary to lay the foundation for carceral abolition. Now, to be sure, there will remain hormonal, morphological, and reproductive distinctions between people. And there will be sexual attractions of varying kinds. But on this abolitionist horizon, people would be free to present in whatever way they desire. There would still be high heels and high tops, skirts and pants and overalls in a world without the sexes. But there would not be policing and enforcement and all of the forms of domination that go with it. People would not be told what they should be, and there would be an effort to avoid at all costs the imposition of gender difference or rules by the state and by private entities. There would be many details to work out, to compensate for reproductive difference, for the fact that only certain persons who choose to carry would carry a fetus to term, those who willingly participate in social reproduction but do not carry a fetus would be encouraged to offset the labor of others through cooperative childcare or other activities. There's no point getting bogged down here in those distributive details. The main point is, that Marx's vision of a classless society needs to be augmented by the ultimate abolition of sex and gender. The two ambitions go hand in hand as forms of genuine cooperation. In this regard, Wittig is right, and so is Jules Gleeson. So let me conclude with Gleeson's words from her essay, Abolitionism in the 21st Century. Abolition is accepted as a destination by many, but the path towards it remains unclear. What seems apparent from this reading of revolutionary theory's history, however, is that much work has already been done to develop strategies of emancipatory abolition. The retrieval of these bygone dialogues and forgotten analyses can hopefully point out the pathway toward a queer communism. And with that, let me welcome you to Marx 513.